The feint had to land before the introduction did, and Eleanor Vane had perhaps 4 seconds to decide where to fall. She stood at the threshold of Lady Carfax's long drawing room, her aunt's gloved fingers a vice on her elbow, and watched the footman's mouth begin to shape the words that would end her. Ahead of her, the room glittered with the kind of people who counted a woman's worth the way a grocer counted apples, by the bruise, by the bloom, by what she might fetch at the end of the day. And somewhere, in that glittering crowd, waited the Duke of Renwick, to whom she was about to be presented as though she were a parcel her aunt had carried up from the country at great personal expense. Eleanor had no intention of being presented to anyone, so she did what she had practiced 3 times in the privacy of her bedchamber that afternoon. She let her knees go soft, let her breath catch high in her throat, let her eyes flutter, as if the heat of the candles had finally undone her. It was a terrible plan. She knew it was a terrible plan even as she committed to it. A fainting woman is a spectacle, and a spectacle is the opposite of an escape. But a fainting woman is also a woman no one expects to converse, and in 5 minutes she could be laid out on a sofa in a cool antechamber with a cloth on her brow and the whole dreadful evening postponed. She counted the panes of the far window as she went down. It was a habit older than she was. 11 panes, 12 with the cracked one in the corner. The counting steadied her, gave her something true to hold, while her body told a lie. She did not reach the floor. An arm came around her before her shoulder had dropped 6 inches. Fast, certain, with no fumbling and no fuss, as though catching falling women were a thing this particular pair of arms did every evening before dinner. A hand spread flat between her shoulder blades. Another closed around her ribs. She was brought up against a wall of dark, superfine wool that smelled of cold air and cedar and something faintly of horses, and held there, upright, with an ease that frightened her more than the fall would have. "Steady," said a voice above her, very low, meant only for her. "I have you." It was not the voice of a man fooled. Eleanor kept her eyes shut. She had committed to the feint. She would die committed to it. Around them, the room had gone into the particular hush that precedes delicious gossip, and she could hear her aunt, Mrs. Drummond, who had spent the family's last good guineas on this gown, and this journey, and this single throw of the dice, making the small, distressed sounds of a woman watching her investment slip to the carpet. "Air," Mrs. Drummond was saying. "She wants air, poor lamb. The journey was so very long." "She wants no such thing," said the low voice, still only for Eleanor, and she felt, rather than heard, the dry amusement folded into it. "Open your eyes, Miss Vane. You have an audience now, and a swoon you commit to for too long becomes a fever, and a fever means a physician, and a physician means a week in a sick room that smells of vinegar. I cannot think that was the plan." It had not been the plan. It had been, precisely, the thing she had hoped to avoid. Eleanor opened her eyes. She had expected to be looking up at some kind footman, or one of Lady Carfax's elderly cousins, or any of the dozen harmless men a falling woman might reasonably topple against. She found instead a face she did not know, and understood at once she should have. A lean, dark, severe face, perhaps 8 and 20, with a hard, clean jaw, and a pair of grey-green eyes that were watching her the way a chess player watches the board 3 moves before the mistake. There was no concern in them. There was no gallantry. There was only a cool, total attention, as if she were the single interesting thing that had happened to him in a year, and he intended to find out why. "There," he said. "Much better. You have excellent colour, for a woman who fainted." His voice did not rise. To the room he might have been murmuring reassurance. To her, he was laying out the evidence. "Your pulse is steady. Your breathing was steady until I named it just now, and then it quickened, which is the opposite of a swoon. And you counted something on your way down. Your lips moved. People who are truly losing the world do not stop to count windows." A pause, almost gentle. 11, was it? 12 with the broken one. Eleanor's heart, which had indeed been perfectly steady, slammed once against her ribs. "Let me go," she said, under her breath, so low it was barely a shape on the air. "In a moment," he said, just as low. "If I let you go now, you will fall again to prove the point, and I will have to catch you again, and we will look like a pair of amateur actors in a barn. Put your weight on my arm. Walk 3 steps. We will find you a chair near the window you are so fond of, and you may recover your dignity at your own pace, and no one in this room will ever know that the most graceful swoon of the season was a fraud." He paused. "I will know. But I am not the one you were trying to escape, so I cannot think it signifies." It was, she thought, the worst possible thing he could have said, because it was so nearly the truth. She took his arm. She had no choice. Her aunt was bearing down with smelling salts, and a face like a thundercloud poorly disguised as tenderness. And the only thing more humiliating than being walked to a chair by a strange, severe man would be being revived in front of 40 people by a vial of hartshorn. She put her hand on his sleeve and felt, beneath the wool, an arm like a ship's timber. And she walked her 3 steps, and she sat in the chair by the 11 and a broken panes, and she arranged her skirts, and she lifted her chin, and she looked her rescuer full in the face with all the cold composure she had left. "I am very much obliged to you, sir," she said, in the voice she kept for creditors and curates. "You may go now. I should not like to keep you from your evening." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, the promise of one, withheld. "That," he said, "would be difficult. You see, the evening was about to begin with an introduction. I rather think it still must." A cold, slow dread began at the base of Eleanor's spine. He stepped back exactly 1 pace and bowed. A precise, economical bow. The bow of a man who has bowed 10,000 times and means none of them. And Lady Carfax, arriving breathless at his elbow, with her turban askew and her rings flashing, did the thing that turned the dread to ice. "Renwick!" cried Lady Carfax. "You wretch! You have stolen the introduction clean out of my hands. Miss Vane, when you are quite recovered, my dear, may I present His Grace, the Duke of Renwick. Your Grace, Miss Eleanor Vane, lately of Hartsmere, the niece of my old friend Mrs. Drummond, and quite the loveliest thing to faint in this house in 20 years. The Duke of Renwick looked down at Eleanor Vane, who had fainted at his feet to avoid being introduced to him, and who now sat trapped in a chair beneath his perfect attention, with no faint left to fall into. "Miss Vane," he said gravely, "we have not met." "No," Eleanor said, "we have not." "I should be sorry to think you exhausted yourself on my account." "I should be sorry to think anything exhausted me, Your Grace. I am not a delicate woman. It was the heat." "It was not the heat," he said pleasantly, "but I admire the consistency." And he bowed again, and was gone into the crowd before she could find a single thing to throw at his retreating back. Eleanor sat very still and counted the panes again, all 11 of them, and the cracked 12th, and she thought, it was a terrible plan. She had known it was a terrible plan. She simply had not imagined it could go this wrong. That the one man in England she had crossed 2 counties to avoid would turn out to be the one man with the wit to catch her, the nerve to keep hold of her, and the maddening discourtesy not to believe her for a single second. Across the room, the Duke of Renwick accepted a glass of wine he did not drink and watched the woman by the window pretend she was not watching him. He had not believed the faint. That much he had told her, and it was true, and it was also the least of what he had not believed. He had not believed, when his godmother wrote to summon him to this house party with its parade of careful daughters, that he would feel anything at all but the cold arithmetic of a man with a problem and a deadline. He had a problem. He had a deadline. He had, in point of fact, exactly 58 days to marry, or lose a great deal more than his pride. And not one of the careful daughters in this room had stirred in him anything but the weary certainty that he would have to choose one of them the way one chooses a horse, by the teeth and the wind, and the willingness to be led. Was that so cold, he asked himself, or only honest? And then a woman in a bronze-shot gown had thrown herself at the floor, rather than be introduced to him, and counted the windows on her way down, and looked up at him with grey eyes full of fury at being caught. And the cold arithmetic had, for the first time in 3 years, gone perfectly quiet. He turned his signet ring once around his finger with his thumb, a thing he did when he was thinking and did not wish to be seen to think. 58 days. And the only woman in England who plainly did not want him. It was, he thought, the most promising development of the entire wretched season. The Duke of Renwick had not always been a man who caught falling women and disbelieved them on principle. He had been, once, long enough ago that he could examine the memory now without flinching, the way one examines a healed bone in cold weather. A perfectly trusting young man with a perfectly ordinary heart, who had loved a girl named Cassandra and believed she loved him, and who had learned in a single afternoon in a sunlit morning room, but what Cassandra had loved was the word Duke, and that the word, attached as it was to a smaller fortune than the new Earl of Brackish could offer, had ceased to be enough. She had been very kind about it. She had cried a little, prettily, with one glove pressed to her cheek. "I shall always be fond of you, you know," she had said, in that soft, pretty voice, as though fondness were any kind of recompense. And she had married the Earl of Brackish 6 weeks later, in a wedding the papers called the event of the year. And Renwick had stood in the church, because not to stand in the church would have been to admit the wound. And he had watched her go up the aisle on another man's arm, and had understood, finally, the single great fact of his life. That he was not a man to the world. He was a title with a man somewhere inside it. And the title was the part they wanted. And the man could be discarded the moment a better title came along. He had been 23. He was 28 now. In the 5 years between, he had become very good indeed at the cold arithmetic, at seeing the calculation behind the blush, the ledger behind the laughter, the way a woman's eyes flicked to the height of his collar and the cut of his coat, and the carriage waiting at the curb before they ever quite reached his face. He did not blame the women for it. It was a hard market, and they had little enough to trade with. He simply declined, now, to pretend it was anything else, and the declining had made him a cold man, and the coldness had made him a duke much spoken of and little known. And that suited him very well, because a man little known cannot be discarded twice, and who, having been thrown away once, would ever consent to stand still for it again. He woke early, the morning after the faint, as he always did, before the household stirred, before the maids came to lay the fires, while the great cold house of his godmother slept around him, and the November dark still pressed grey against the glass. He had never learned to sleep late. Sleeping late was for men whose minds were quiet, and his mind had not been quiet since he was 23. He dressed himself rather than ring for a man, and he went down through the silent house to the breakfast room, where a single footman was raking the grate back to life, and he stood at the window, with a cup of coffee gone tepid in his hand, and watched the frost burn slowly off the parterre, as the sky greyed toward a sun it had no real intention of producing. In his right coat pocket, where it always was, his thumb found the small carved knight. It was a chess piece, ivory gone amber with handling, a knight no taller than his thumb, the horse's head bowed as if listening. It had belonged to his brother once, to Harry, who had been lost to a fever in Portugal with the regiment, and left behind a wife who did not long survive him, and a daughter of 3 who had survived them both, and who was the entire reason the Duke of Renwick stood in a cold breakfast room, with 57 days left to find a wife. The knight had been in Harry's pocket when the trunk came home. Renwick had carried it ever since. He was not a sentimental man. He told himself it was only a habit, the way the counting had been only a habit for the woman by the window, and he believed that exactly as much as he had believed her faint. The child's name was Lucy. She was 6 now, and she lived at his estate at Renwick Cross, with a nurse who adored her and a pony she had named, with the magnificent literalism of the young, Pony. And she played chess very badly and with enormous seriousness, and she was the one creature on the earth the Duke of Renwick loved without arithmetic. And by the terms of the trust his late uncle had drawn up, a clever, cruel, well-meaning instrument designed to ensure the child was raised in a settled household, rather than by a bachelor who might neglect her, Renwick would keep his guardianship of her only if he were a married man by the last day of the year. Neglect her. Had he ever, in 5 cold years, neglected anything but his own heart? If he were not married, Lucy passed to the care of the nearest suitable married relation. The nearest suitable married relation was the family of Adela Crane. Renwick turned the night over once in his pocket and watched the frost retreat across the gravel, and thought, with the cold clarity of a man who has done the sum many times, that he would marry a stranger, and like her or not, as fortune decreed. But he would not let Lucy go to the Cranes, who would correct the literalism out of her, and the chess out of her, and the gladness out of her, within a 12-month, and call it improvement. So, he needed a wife. He had known that for months. What he had not known, until a woman threw herself at the floor of his godmother's drawing room, was that he might actually want one. He heard the door. He did not turn at once. The footman had gone, and the tread was light and quick and trying very hard to be silent. And he knew without looking, by some sense he had not been aware of possessing until that moment, exactly who had come down before the household to be alone, and found the room already occupied. "Miss Vane," he said to the window. "You are an early riser. I had not expected company." There was a silence behind him of the particular quality of a woman deciding whether to flee. "I did not expect it either," said Eleanor Vane at last, "or I should have stayed upstairs. Good morning, Your Grace. I will take my coffee elsewhere." "You will take it here," he said, "because elsewhere has no fire lit yet, and you are cold. I can hear it in your voice. Sit by the grate. I shall stand at the window, and we need not speak. I am told I am restful company when I do not speak." "You are told wrong," Eleanor said. But she came in, and she sat by the grate because she was cold, and because, he understood this, watching her reflection arrange itself in the dark glass. Pride is a luxury, and warmth is a necessity, and a clever woman knows the difference. They did not speak. The fire took. The grey at the window warmed by 1/2 degree, no more. Eleanor held her cup in both hands, and looked at the flames, and not at the long dark back of the man at the window. And the Duke of Renwick looked at the frost, and not at the woman at the fire. And for the space of perhaps 4 minutes, the breakfast room of Carfax Hall held 2 people who were each acutely, furiously aware of the other, and determined to die before they showed it. It was Eleanor who broke. She had always been the one to break a silence. She found them unbearable, the way other people found cold water unbearable, a thing the body wished to be out of. "You will tell my aunt," she said, "about last night, the faint." "Will I?" "It is the sort of thing men tell. A clever woman caught in a lie. It is too good a story to keep." "I had not noticed," said the Duke, "that you were a clever woman caught in a lie. I had noticed that you were a desperate woman caught in a plan. The two are not the same, and I find I have very little interest in the first, and a great deal of interest in the second." He turned from the window at last, and leaned his shoulders against the shutter, and folded his arms, and looked at her with that cool, total attention that made her want to count something. "No, I shall not tell your aunt. I shall not tell anyone. Your secret is dull to me, Miss Vane. A young woman did not wish to be married off to a cold duke twice her consequence and half her wit, and took the only weapon a young woman is given, which is her own collapse. There is nothing in that I did not already know about the world. What interests me is the part you have not told. There is no part I have not told. There is always a part," he said, "that is not told. You did not faint to avoid a duke. No woman crosses 2 counties and ruins a gown, and risks a physician's vinegar to avoid a duke. A duke is the thing they are sent to catch. You fainted to avoid being caught by one. Those are different fears, Miss Vane, and the second is a great deal more interesting than the first. He paused. Who taught you that being chosen was the danger? Eleanor set her cup down on the hearth with a click that was louder than she intended. That is impertinent, she said. It is, he agreed. I am 28 and a duke, and have not been spoken to honestly since I was 23. Impertinence is the only conversation I have left. Indulge me or do not, but do not pretend you are shocked. You are the least shockable woman in this house, which is the first thing I liked about you, and there are not yet two. There it was again. The dry thing folded under the cold. The wit that kept ambushing her from beneath the severity. Eleanor distrusted it more than she would have distrusted open cruelty. Cruelty she knew how to stand against. This she did not. I will tell you one true thing, she said, and then you will leave me to my coffee, because I find I cannot bear to be read like a bill of fare. 2 years ago, I was very nearly married. He was a pleasant man, and I believed he was fond of me, and the whole of our acquaintance behaved as though it was settled. And then my father's affairs went wrong. A ship, a partner. The particulars do not signify. The particulars never signify. And the settlement that had seemed so warm went cold in an afternoon, and the pleasant man discovered an urgent reason to visit his cousins in Northumberland. And I last saw him crossing to the other side of a staircase at the Eltham route, so that he should not have to bow to me in public. She lifted her chin. I do not tell you this for pity. I tell you so that you will understand I have been appraised once already, Your Grace, and found wanting the moment the figure beneath me changed, and I'd rather throw myself at every flaw in England than stand still and be appraised again. There. Now you have the part that is not told. I hope it was worth the impertinence. For a long moment, the Duke of Renwick said nothing at all. The fire snapped. Outside, very faint, a groom was leading horses across the cobbled yard, and the bells of the village church beyond the park struck the half-hour, thin and clear in the frozen air. When he spoke, the dryness was gone, and what was under it surprised them both. His name, said the Duke. The pleasant man. I should like it. Not to do anything so vulgar as call him out. I have no standing, and you would not thank me. But I have a long memory, and a great many dinners to give, and I find I should enjoy, over the next 40 years, the small, private pleasure of never once inviting him. Eleanor stared at him. You think I am making sport of you, he said. I am not. I am telling you that I know precisely the staircase you mean. Not that staircase, but its brother. Mine was a morning room in Berkeley Square, and a girl named Cassandra and one glove pressed to her cheek, and that the figure beneath a man can change as easily as the figure beneath a woman, and that I too have been crossed away from on a public stair, so that no one need bow to the lesser fortune. We are, Miss Vane, the two most thoroughly appraised people in this house. It is why neither of us could faint convincingly to save our lives. We have both watched the ledger win too many times to believe in the swoon. The grey at the window had warmed to something almost like dawn. Eleanor found that her hands had stopped being cold. Then we are agreed on one thing, she said slowly. That this, all of this, the party, the daughters, the introductions, is a market, and we are the goods, and the swoon does not work. We are agreed on one thing, said the Duke. Now let me tell you a second, and then you may go to your coffee, for I have kept you long enough, and your aunt will wake soon and want her investment polished. I came to this house to choose a wife, because I must be a married man by the last day of this year, or I shall lose something I will not lose. That is my plan, Miss Vane, and it is as desperate as your faint, and a great deal less graceful, for at least your collapse was over in a moment, while mine requires me to stand in a drawing room every night for 8 weeks, and let careful daughters appraise me as though I could not see them doing it. You wish not to be chosen. I am compelled to choose. We are at the two ends of the same wretched rope." He pushed off the shutter and came across the room and stood a polite 3 feet from her chair and looked down at her with an expression she could not read at all. "It occurs to me that two people at the two ends of the same rope might do worse than to hold it together for a little while and pull in the same direction and confound the lot of them." "That," Eleanor said, "is the second most alarming sentence anyone has ever spoken to me." "What was the first?" "May I present His Grace the Duke of Renwick?" And the Duke of Renwick laughed, a short, startled, entirely genuine bark of a laugh, the laugh of a man who has not been surprised into one in a very long while. And somewhere in the cold breakfast room of Carfax Hall, 57 days before the end of the year, something that neither of them had planned, and both of them would have forbidden, began, very quietly, against all the arithmetic, to grow. The trouble with confounding the lot of them, Eleanor discovered, was that the lot of them did not intend to be confounded. Chief among them was her aunt. Mrs. Drummond was not a cruel woman. Eleanor had to remind herself of this, sometimes hourly. But she was a frightened one, and frightened people do cruel arithmetic and call it love. The widow of Eleanor's father's brother, left with a jointure that had looked adequate in 1809 and looked like starvation now. Mrs. Drummond had taken in her brother-in-law's 2 daughters, when the ship and the partner and the particulars had done their work, and she had fed them and clothed them on a shrinking income, and reminded them of it with the regularity of a clock, and she had pinned the whole of her remaining hope on the elder one's face. Eleanor's face was to be the family's salvation. It was to be converted, by means of this house party, into a settlement that would keep Mrs. Drummond in coal and Eleanor's younger sister Jane in slippers, and the 3 of them out of the 2-room respectability that waited at the bottom of the ledger like a grave. Jane was 18, and at home in Hartsmere with a hired companion, and she had a small dowry of £400 that their father had settled on her before the ship, in the days when £400 had been a trifle and not a fortune. It was the one untouched thing the family had left, and Eleanor had understood, somewhere on the cold road between Hartsmere and Carfax Hall, that if she did not produce a settlement of her own this season, her aunt would begin, gently and tearfully, and with many references to necessity, to spend Jane's £400. Because a frightened woman spends the future to survive the present, and calls it love, and is not entirely wrong. So Eleanor could not simply refuse to marry. That was the thing the Duke did not yet know, and the thing she did not intend to tell him. She did not wish to be chosen, but she could not afford not to be. She had to come out of this house with a settlement, or watch her sister's only safety poured into her aunt's coal scuttle, 1 frightened guinea at a time. Which made the Duke's clever proposal, that they hold the rope together and confound the market, a luxury she could not afford. A pretend alliance kept her safe from being appraised, yes, but it produced no settlement, and a season spent in a flirtation that everyone could see led nowhere was a season Jane could not get back. She was thinking exactly this 2 mornings later, in the long glass conservatory at the cold end of the house, where she had retreated to be alone among the orange trees and the dripping ferns and the great cold panes that she could count without anyone remarking on it. When the door at the far end opened, and the one person more dangerous to her purpose than the Duke himself came in out of the frost, shaking the cold from a sable muff, and smiling at Eleanor with all her perfect teeth. "Miss Vane," said Miss Adela Crane. "Quite alone? But then you are so often quite alone. I have noticed it. One does notice the women who stand a little apart. It is usually because they are calculating, and I find calculating women so restful, for one always knows where one is with them. May I sit? I have come to be friends." She had not come to be friends. Eleanor knew this the way she knew the count of the panes, instantly and without effort and with complete certainty. But she gestured to the iron bench among the ferns, and Miss Crane sat, arranging her skirts of deep wine-coloured velvet with the care of a woman who has never once in her life let warmth get the better of advantage, and Eleanor composed her face and prepared to be told something she was not meant to know. "I shall be plain," said Miss Crane, "because you are a sensible creature, and plainness will save us both an hour. You have been seen with my cousin Renwick. The whole house has seen it. The breakfast room, the library, the turn about the terrace yesterday that lasted, I am told, 20 minutes longer than a turn about the terrace need last in November. And I have come to spare you a disappointment, because I am soft-hearted, and because I should hate to see a girl of your situation waste her one good season chasing a thing she cannot have." "And what thing is that?" "Him," said Miss Crane, pleasantly. "Oh, he will marry. He must. That is the amusing part. And I see from your face you do not know it, so let me be the friend who tells you. My late uncle, who was a clever man and did not trust Renwick's bachelor habits, tied up the guardianship of his little ward in a trust. The Duke keeps the child only so long as he is a married man by the last night of the year. If he is not, and there are not 8 weeks left, Miss Vane, do the sum, the child comes to my family. To me, in time, for I am the married daughter that will be. So you understand the comedy of it. He is not courting you. He is shopping, against a clock, for a wife who will do. Any wife, the nearest respectable wife. A wife he can sign by Christmas and forget by 12th night. And a penniless girl who faints in drawing rooms is exactly the kind of bargain a desperate man snatches up when the better goods have all said no. She rose and shook out the wine-coloured velvet and smiled down at Eleanor with enormous kindness. "I tell you so that when he offers, and he may, my dear, he very well may, for he is running out of days, you will understand it is the clock that speaks, and not the man. There is no insult in being chosen by a clock, but there is no warmth in it either. I thought you would rather know." She went out through the frost-bright door, and the cold came in after her, and Eleanor Vane sat alone in the long glass house among the dripping ferns, and counted the panes, all 41 of them, the great cold panes of the conservatory roof, twice through, while the thing Adela Crane had said settled into her like frost into stone. He is shopping, against a clock, for a wife who will do. It was not, she told herself, anything she had not already known. He had told her himself in the breakfast room, "I must be a married man by the last day of this year, or I shall lose something I will not lose." He had not hidden the clock. He had laid it on the table between them, like an honest man laying down his cards. The only thing Adela Crane had added was the word forget. A wife you can sign by Christmas and forget by 12th night. And that was Adela's poison, not his. And Eleanor was too clever to drink another woman's poison. But the clock changed the shape of the thing entirely, and the new shape was not romance, and was not even alliance. It was a transaction with a deadline, and Eleanor Vane had been waiting her whole life to be offered a transaction with a deadline, because a transaction was a thing she could understand, and a deadline was a thing she could use. He needed a wife by the last night of the year. She needed a settlement before her aunt began to spend Jane's £400. He had something she required. She had something he required, and the great clean, cold relief of it, after 2 days of being read like a bill of fare, after the alarming dry laugh that kept ambushing her, was that it need not, after all, have anything to do with the way his arm had felt like a ship's timber, or the way he had said his name, the pleasant man. I should like it. It was only arithmetic. She had said so herself. It was only arithmetic, and arithmetic was safe, and she would go to him and propose the sum, and they would both know exactly where they stood, and no one would ever be appraised again, because there would be nothing left to appraise, only 2 columns of figures that happened to balance. She found him in the library, alone, with a chessboard set up before him, and no opponent across it, frowning at a position as though it had personally wronged him. "I know about the trust," Eleanor said from the doorway. "Your cousin told me. The clock, the child, the last night of the year. She meant it as a cruelty, I have decided to take it as an opportunity. May I sit? The Duke of Renwick looked up from the board, and something crossed his face too fast to name, and was gone, and the cool attention came back over it like water over a stone. Sit, he said. You are about to propose to me. I should not like you to do it standing. I am about to propose a bargain, Eleanor corrected, sitting, which is a different thing, and I will thank you not to make it sound like the other, for the other is exactly what we have both agreed to despise. Here is the sum, Your Grace. You need a wife by the last night of the year, or you lose your ward to a woman in wine-coloured velvet, who will correct the gladness out of her. I need a settlement before my aunt spends my sister's only dowry, which she will begin to do the moment she decides I have failed. You require a respectable wife, who will not plague you for affection you have not got to give. I require a competent husband, who will not require affection I have spent and have none left. We are, as you so memorably put it, at the two ends of the same rope. I propose we stop holding it and tie it. She folded her hands. Marry me, Your Grace. Not because the clock says so, and not because I fainted at your feet. God forbid either of us should be sentimental about that. But because the figures balance, and we both know they balance, and neither of us will ever once have to wonder whether the other married for the ledger. We will have married for the ledger. It is the only honest marriage either of us is likely to get. For the second time in 3 days, the Duke of Renwick was silent for a long while. He looked at the chessboard. He moved a single piece, a knight, Eleanor saw, lifted and set down in a small, precise arc, the only piece on a board that does not move in a line. And then he looked up at her, and the thing in his face this time did not go away fast enough, and she saw it, and did not know what it was, and it frightened her more than Adela Crane's poison. You are offering me, he said, the one thing I came here certain I could not have. A wife who has no illusions. A marriage with the lie taken out of it before it begins. He turned the knight over in his fingers. Do you know, Miss Vane, that I have lain awake for 3 years dreading exactly the marriage you have just described. The cold, balanced sum, the figures that meet, the wife across the breakfast table who married the title and tolerates the man. And that you have just offered it to me as though it were a gift, and that the dreadful thing, the truly dreadful thing, is that coming from you it sounds like one? He set the knight down. Yes, I accept your bargain, with one amendment, which I will tell you now, plainly, so that you cannot accuse me later of having smuggled it in. I accept the sum, the figures balance. We will marry for the ledger and never once wonder. But I reserve the right. And here the dryness came back, the wit surfacing through the cold like a fish through dark water. I reserve the entire and inalienable right, Miss Vane, to discover over the next 50 years that I was wrong about you, and to be insufferably pleased about it. You may not forbid me that. It is the only romantic clause in the contract, and I will have it, or no bargain. You may discover anything you like, Eleanor said, so long as you do not expect me to discover it back. I expect nothing back, said the Duke of Renwick. I have made an art of expecting nothing back. Shall we shake hands? I find I should like to begin the only honest marriage of my life, with the only honest gesture I know. They shook hands across the chessboard, over the bowed head of the ivory knight, and that, Eleanor would think of it much later, when everything had gone wrong and then right again. That was the moment the whole sensible arithmetical structure they had built to keep themselves safe began, without either of them noticing, to fill with something neither of them had budgeted for. The betrothal was announced at dinner 2 nights later, and the house party reacted precisely as a house party reacts when the prize is suddenly removed from the table, with delighted public congratulation and furious private recalculation. Mrs. Drummond wept into her soup with joy and relief, and a vindication so complete it briefly silenced her. Lady Carfax, who had brought these 2 cold, clever creatures under her roof and watched them collide with the satisfaction of a woman whose matchmaking instincts are rarely thanked, and never wrong, lifted her glass and said only, "Well," in a tone that contained an entire essay, and drank. And Adela Crane, at the foot of the table in her wine-coloured velvet, smiled and lifted her own glass to the happy couple. And the smile did not reach her eyes. And Eleanor, watching her over the candle flames, understood that the matter was not finished. A woman who has lost a ward and a fortune in a single dinner does not concede. She withdraws to think. And what she thinks coldly, and at length, and to a purpose. But that was for later. For the present, there was the strange new country of being betrothed to a man one had bargained with rather than fallen for. A country with no maps, in which Eleanor kept stepping on things she had not expected to be there. There was, for instance, the matter of her sister. She had told the Duke about Jane's £400 in the course of laying out the figures, because the figures required it. He could not understand why she needed a settlement so urgently, without understanding what the alternative cost. She had told it flatly, as arithmetic. She had not expected him to do anything about it. And so it undid her, rather, when a letter came from Hartsmere 4 days later, in which Jane, 18, breathless, underlining everything twice, reported that a draft had arrived from the Duke of Renwick's man of business, settling £400 upon Miss Jane Vane in her own name, in trust, untouchable by anyone, so that, the Duke's enclosed note to Eleanor read, in a hand as economical as his bow, "Whatever becomes of our bargain, your sister's safety is no longer a hostage to it. This is not a wedding gift, and you will oblige me by not thanking me for it. It is the removal of a weapon that was being held to your head, and I find I dislike, on principle, weapons held to the heads of women I have shaken hands with. You may consider us square. R." Eleanor read the note 3 times. Then she folded it very small and put it in the place where she kept the things she could not look at directly. And she went and found the Duke in the stable yard, where he was inspecting a horse he had no intention of buying because it was warmer than the drawing room. And she said, "You were not to make me thank you." And he said, "Then do not." And she said, "I shall not." And they stood in the cold yard, not thanking each other for a long while. And the groom looked from one to the other and decided it was above his station to understand the gentry. And was right. It was, she told herself, only the removal of a weapon. He had said so himself. It changed nothing in the arithmetic. The figures still balanced. They merely balanced now with one fewer thing held to her head. And a clever woman does not mistake the lifting of a threat for tenderness. She told herself this in the cold yard, and she told herself this at dinner, and she told herself this in the long dark of her bedchamber, where it did not work nearly so well, because in the dark there was no one to perform composure for, and the truth a woman tells herself in the dark is a different truth than the one she tells at noon. The truth in the dark was, no one had ever taken a weapon away from her before. They had only ever handed her sharper ones, and called it love. She met the child by accident, which was the only way she could have borne to meet her. The Duke had said nothing of bringing his ward to Carfax Hall. It would have been a declaration, a thing too tender for 2 people conducting an honest transaction. But Lady Carfax, who understood the Duke better than the Duke understood himself, had written privately to Renwick Cross, and so, on the bright, bitter morning a fortnight before Christmas, a small travelling carriage came up the drive, and out of it climbed a nurse, and a great many bandboxes, and a child of 6 in a scarlet cloak, who took one look at the enormous, unfamiliar house and the enormous, unfamiliar people, and went absolutely white and still, in the way of a child who has learned that the world rearranges itself without warning. Eleanor was crossing the hall when it happened. She saw the Duke come out of the library at the sound of the wheels, saw him cross the marble fast, faster than she had ever seen him move, the cool, unhurried Duke of Renwick, going down on one knee on the cold floor, with no thought at all for his pantaloons. And she saw the white, still child see him, and come apart, and run, and be caught. And she saw him gather the scarlet cloak up against the dark coat, and hold it the way he had held Eleanor on the night of the faint, with that same certainty, that same no-fumbling competence. Except that this time, there was nothing cool in his face at all. This time his face was simply open, the way a door is open, the way she had not known his face could be. "There," he was saying, into the child's hair. "There. You are here. I have you. I have you, Lucy mine. You are here and I have you, and you are not going anywhere I am not, do you understand me? Not anywhere, not ever." And the child was saying something into his neck that Eleanor could not hear. And the Duke laughed, the genuine bark of a laugh, shaken half to pieces, and said, "Yes, Pony too. Pony is coming by the slow road with the grooms, because Pony does not care for fast carriages. You are quite right. You remembered." And over the child's shoulder, his eyes found Eleanor's across the hall. And there was no arithmetic in them whatever. And Eleanor understood, with the cold, clear suddenness of the count reaching a number she had not expected, that she had made a serious miscalculation. She had agreed to marry a sum. She had not agreed to this. The child's name, when she was set down and her cloak straightened and her composure restored, with the bottomless resilience of the very young, turned out to belong to a person of decided opinions. Lucy regarded Eleanor with the frank, assessing stare of a creature who has not yet learned to dissemble it, and said, "Are you the one Uncle is marrying, so I can stay?" "Lucy," said the nurse, scandalized. "It is a fair question," said Eleanor, before the Duke could intervene, and crouched down to the child's level on the cold marble, careless of her own skirts. "Because there are questions that must be answered eye to eye, or not at all." "Yes, I am the one. Do you mind it?" Lucy considered this with enormous seriousness. "Adela was going to have me," she said. "She came once. She said my chess was a waste of a girl's afternoon, and she took the board away, and I cried, and Uncle wrote a letter, and the board came back." She delivered this in the flat, unhurried voice of a child laying out evidence. "Do you think chess is a waste of a girl's afternoon?" "I think," said Eleanor, "that anyone who would take a chessboard away from a child who loves it has told you everything you need to know about them, and saved you the trouble of finding it out the long way. No, I do not think it is a waste. Will you teach me how badly you play? Your uncle says you play very badly and with enormous seriousness, and I find I should like to see it." There was a silence. The child's eyes went, just once, to her uncle, checking the way Eleanor checked the panes. And the Duke said nothing, only looked at Eleanor crouched on the floor of the great cold hall, talking to a 6-year-old as though she were a person. And the child read whatever she found in his face, and turned back to Eleanor, and held out one small mittened hand, with the air of a general accepting a treaty. "I play extremely badly," said Lucy with pride. "Uncle says it is because I only like the knights, and I make them do all the work. Come and see." And Eleanor took the small mittened hand and let herself be led away to the library to lose at chess to a child who only liked the knights. And the Duke of Renwick stood alone in the hall, and turned the ivory knight over in his pocket. The knight that only moved in arcs, the knight that did all the work, and did not trust himself, just then, to follow them. The trap, when Adela Crane finally sprang it, was sprung in public, because a trap sprung in private wastes its cruelty. It was the night of Lady Carfax's Christmas ball, the great set piece of the party, with the long gallery opened, and 40 candles in each chandelier, and half the county driven in over frozen roads to dance. And Eleanor, who had armoured herself in a gown of deep emerald silk that Lady Carfax had insisted on as a betrothal present, and which made her look, the looking-glass told her with some surprise, not like a bargain at all, was standing up from a set with the Duke when Adela Crane chose her moment. "How well you dance, Miss Vane," said Adela, loudly enough to turn 3 nearby heads. "For a woman whose constitution is so delicate. We were all so alarmed for you that first night, fainting clean away at his Grace's feet the very first instant you laid eyes on him. Such a romantic affliction, so sudden, so perfectly timed. She let the words hang and smiled, and the 3 nearby heads became 6. Do you know, I have wondered since. We have all wondered, I think. However did you know it was His Grace you were fainting toward? In a room of 40 gentlemen. To fall at precisely the right pair of feet. It argues either a truly providential weakness, Miss Vane, or a truly remarkable aim. The gallery, in the way of ballrooms, had gone quiet in a widening ring, the music between sets, the listening sharp and delighted. Eleanor felt the old, cold dread start at the base of her spine. Felt the eyes, the appraisal, the ledger opening, and felt, underneath it, the practiced flutter of the faint she could still, even now, fall into. She could go down right here, end the scene, be carried out, escape. She did not go down. She had fainted to avoid being appraised once, and it had delivered her into the arms of the one man who saw through it. And she was done. She understood this with sudden, cold finality, standing in emerald silk in the ringing quiet. She was entirely done with falling to escape rooms. A woman who falls hands the room the verdict. She would stand and let them appraise her and beat them at the count. You have wondered a great deal about my feet, Miss Crane, Eleanor said, and pitched it perfectly, clear and unhurried, so that the ring of listeners leaned in and the 3 heads became 16. I am flattered by the attention. They are very ordinary feet, but since you have raised it so generously in company, I shall answer in company, for I find I have no taste for being asked a question privately that was meant to be heard by 20. She turned, unhurried, including the ring, making them her audience rather than Adela's. I did faint that first night. It was inexcusably missish of me, and I have been ashamed of it since. And I shall tell you exactly why I did it, because the truth is so much duller than your aim, Miss Crane, and I think these good people deserve the dull truth over the clever lie. I fainted because I did not wish to be married off. I had been brought to this house, against my own judgment, to be presented to a duke as though I were goods on a counter, and the prospect so appalled me that I behaved like a coward and collapsed rather than face it. There. That is the providential weakness. It was not weakness at all. It was cowardice, and I own it freely, and the only providence in the whole affair. And here she let her eyes go, just once, to the Duke, who was standing very still at the edge of the ring, with an expression no one in that gallery had ever seen on the Duke of Renwick's face. Was that the man I had crossed 2 counties to avoid turned out to be the one man in England who refused to let me fall on my own face for a lie. He caught me. He did not believe me for an instant. And he had the discourtesy. A ripple of startled laughter ran round the ring. The very great discourtesy, Miss Crane, to be more interested in why a woman would rather faint than be appraised than in whether her feet had aim. We are betrothed because he found my cowardice more honest than other women's courage. I cannot think it a thing you would understand. But you did ask, in company, and now you have been answered, in company, and I think the set is forming again, and I should hate to make us both late for it. She curtsied, to Adela Crane, precisely, with not 1 degree more or less than rank required, and turned, and walked back into the dance on the arm of the Duke of Renwick, who had crossed the ring to offer it without a word, and behind her, the gallery let out its breath in a long, delighted murmur, and the verdict it rendered was not the one Adela Crane had come to collect. You did not faint, the Duke said quietly, as the music took them. No, said Eleanor. I find I have given it up. It never once got me anything I wanted, and it got me a great deal I did not. I have decided to stand still and let them look, and beat them at the count. You may take the credit if you like. It was your discourtesy that taught me. I shall not take the credit, he said. I shall take something far better. I shall take the memory of Adela Crane's face, which I intend to live on through several hard winters. And then, lower, with the dryness gone and the open thing under it that she had seen in the hall with the child. Eleanor. May I call you, Eleanor? We are betrothed a fortnight, and I have called you Miss Vane through the whole of it because I did not think I had earned the other, and I find tonight that I would rather have earned it than anything I own." She had not known, until he said her name, that she had been waiting for him to say her name. "You may call me Eleanor," she said, and the dance turned them, and the 40 candles in each chandelier swam together into one warm river of gold. And for the length of that one set, in a borrowed emerald gown, in the arms of a man she had agreed to marry strictly as a matter of arithmetic, Eleanor Vane forgot entirely to count anything at all. The best week of Eleanor's life was the week she had not budgeted for, and she knew it was the best even while it was happening, which is a rare and dangerous knowledge. Christmas came to Carfax Hall, and with it a kind of suspended ease, as though the clock that drove them all had agreed to hold its breath over the holiday. Lucy taught Eleanor chess, and Eleanor taught Lucy to count the panes of the conservatory. There were 41, Eleanor showed her. 41 with the long crack in the corner one. And the child took to counting the way she had taken to the knights, with passion and inaccuracy. And the Duke found them there one grey morning, both flat on their backs on the conservatory floor, counting the roof aloud, and getting it wrong on purpose to make each other laugh. And he did not say anything sensible at all. He lay down on the cold tiles beside them in his good coat, the Duke of Renwick, and counted the panes wrong too. There was an inside joke by then, the way there is always an inside joke when something real is growing. It had started with a Latin tag on a brass plate beneath one of the orange trees in the conservatory. Citrus aurantium, which the Duke had read aloud with great authority, as though it meant something tender. And Eleanor, who had been taught Latin by a blue-stocking aunt on her mother's side, and had forgotten almost all of it, except the power to be insufferable about it, had informed him that he had just romantically murmured bitter orange at her. And the Duke had taken this correction with such wounded dignity that bitter orange became, by the alchemy of the very happy, the thing they said to each other instead of the thing they had agreed not to say. He said it over the chessboard. She said it across the breakfast table. Lucy, who did not understand it in the least, said it to the nurse, who was scandalized on general principle, and bitter orange rang through the cold corridors of Carfax Hall that Christmas week, like a small, private bell that only 3 people could hear. On the morning of the day everything broke, before it broke, the Duke found Eleanor alone in the conservatory at first light, counting the panes out of habit, and he came and stood beside her, and pressed something small and hard into her palm, and closed her fingers over it before she could see what it was. "What is this?" "The knight," he said. "Harry's knight. My brother's. I've carried it 3 years. You will have noticed me at it. I find I do not need it any longer to know the thing it told me. And I should like you to have it. Against the day, there will be such a day. We are neither of us sentimental, but we are both of us honest. So I will say it plainly. Against the day when one of us is afraid, and needs to hold something true while the body tells a lie. You taught me that. A person who is truly losing the world stops to count the windows. Hold the night instead. It only ever moves in arcs, and it does all the work, and it goes where the straight pieces cannot. And I have come to think, Eleanor, that it is a very great deal more like you than like me. He folded her fingers tighter. When the lilacs come out in May, there is a long walk of them at Renwick Cross. My mother planted them. I should like to show you the lilacs. I find I am speaking of May as though it were a thing we both already lived in. I had not meant to. But there it is, bitter orange. And Eleanor Vane stood in the cold glass house with her late brother-in-law's chess knight warm in her fist, and the future tense spoken at last without a flinch, and understood that the careful arithmetical structure she had built to keep herself safe had, at some point she could not name, quietly filled to the brim and overflowed, and that she was no longer conducting a transaction. She was in love with the man she had fainted to avoid. She had been for some time, and there was nothing in the ledger anywhere that told her what to do about it. because love had never once been in the figures. And now, it was the only figure there was. Adela Crane sprang her last trap not in the gallery, but in the small green sitting room off the library, where she knew Eleanor went each afternoon to write to Jane. And she sprang it with paper, because paper is the cruelest weapon in the world. It does not raise its voice, and it cannot be argued with, and it lies in the hand, looking exactly like the truth. "I shall not stay," said Adela, who had clearly come to stay. "I came only to return something that is yours by right, now that you are to be his wife. A wife should know what she is signing. I should have wished someone to tell me." She laid a folded sheet on the writing table at Eleanor's elbow, within easy reach, the way one lays down a winning card. "It is in his own hand. You will know it. You have had his little notes. I came by it honestly. His man of business is a careful person, but careful persons keep copies, and copies can be bought. And I am, as you know, a woman of means until the last night of the year." She moved to the door. "I do hope you will not faint, Miss Vane. You have given that up, I hear, and it would be such a pity to relapse." And she was gone, and the folded sheet lay on the table, looking exactly like the truth. Eleanor did not pick it up for a long time. She knew, the cold, clear count of her told her, that nothing good was ever delivered by Adela Crane, that the sheet was poison the way the conservatory speech had been poison, that the wise thing, the thing a clever woman does, was to carry it unread to the fire and watch it curl. She knew all of that, and she picked it up anyway, because there is a wound in every person that wants its own confirmation, and Eleanor's wound had wanted this particular proof since she was 23 and watched a pleasant man cross to the other side of a staircase. It was his hand. There was no mistaking it. The economical hand of the notes. The hand that had written, "Your sister's safety is no longer a hostage." It was dated the first days of November, before the house party had assembled, before she had ever set foot in Carfax Hall, and it was addressed to his man of business, and it was a copy, as Adela had said, and Eleanor read it, once, fast, the way one swallows a draught one is afraid of, and then she read it again, slowly, and the second reading was the one that did the work. "Secure the Vane connection without delay," the Duke of Renwick had written, in the first days of November, before the faint, before the breakfast room, before bitter orange, before the night. The girl is well enough, penniless, which suits, for a penniless wife expects little and is grateful for less. She has no people to speak of, and a guardian eager to be rid of her, which removes every obstacle. I do not require affection, and she, by all accounts, has none to spend, which is the whole of her recommendation. Settle a sum on the younger sister to bind the elder's compliance, and let the thing be done before Christmas. I am out of time to be particular. The fire snapped in the grate. Outside the green sitting room, very faint, came the sound of Lucy's voice in the corridor, counting something aloud and getting it wrong, and a man's voice, his voice, correcting her with the open, undefended gladness that Eleanor had thought, fool that she was, had something to do with her. Settle a sum on the younger sister to bind the elder's compliance. So that was the £400. Not the removal of a weapon, the purchase of one. He had bought Jane's safety the way a man buys a horse's bridle, to lead the animal more quietly. And Eleanor had stood in the cold stable yard refusing to thank him for it, and feeling, God help her, that no one had ever taken a weapon away from her before, when all the while he had been handing her a sharper one, and she, exactly like every fool before her, had called it love. She understood it all now, in one cold, descending count. He had chosen her because she was penniless and biddable, and had no affection to plague him with. He had wanted a wife who would expect nothing, and she had promised him one across a chessboard. And then she had been imbecile enough to fall in love with her own contract. The bitter orange, the night, the lilacs in May. He had been securing the connection. A man out of time to be particular performs tenderness the way a clever woman performs a feint, because it is the fastest way out of the room. He had appraised her on paper before ever she arrived, and found her cheap and convenient and grateful, and everything since had been the polishing of an investment, and she had let herself be polished, and she had liked it. She did not weep. She had wept once over a man, at 23, on a staircase, and she had promised herself the staircase was the last of it, and she kept her promises, even when they cost her everything. She folded the letter very small. She put it in the place where she kept the things she could not look at directly, beside his other note. The two of them together now, the lie and the lie. And then she went and found her aunt and said, in a voice with no faint left in it anywhere, "We are leaving. Tonight, if the roads will take us. Tomorrow at first light, if they will not. I will not marry the Duke of Renwick. Do not ask me why, for I will not tell you. And do not argue, for it will not serve." Pack. It was the flight, more than anything Adela had done, that showed Eleanor the truth of her aunt. She had expected Mrs. Drummond to rage, to weep, to invoke necessity, to stand in the doorway with her arms full of the family's ruin and refuse to let it walk out into the snow. She had braced for it. And instead, she came upon her aunt in the blue bedchamber an hour later, in the candle-lit dark, not packing at all, but sitting on the edge of the bed with the creditor's letter open in her lap. Eleanor knew the look of a creditor's letter at 40 paces, the cheap paper, the careful, threatening courtesy. And Mrs. Drummond's hands were shaking, the way old hands shake. And she was not weeping for the lost settlement at all. She was looking at a small, worn miniature she had taken from somewhere, a portrait of a young man in an old-fashioned collar, and she was holding it the way Lucy had held her uncle in the hall, as though it were the one fixed thing in a world that rearranged itself without warning. And her lips were moving, and she was counting the money that was not there, Eleanor understood. The pounds and the shillings, the way Eleanor counted pains, the way the frightened count the thing they cannot hold. Mrs. Drummond looked up and saw Eleanor in the doorway and put the miniature away quickly, ashamed, the way one hides a wound. "My husband," she said, before Eleanor could speak, defiant and small. "Your uncle. I am not always... I do remember, you know, that I was loved once, before I became a frightened old woman who counts other people's daughters into settlements. I was loved. He would be ashamed of what fear has made of me. I know it. You need not look at me so. I know it better than you can tell me." She drew herself up, the creditor's letter trembling in her lap. "I will pack. I will not ask you why, but you will tell me one thing, Eleanor, and then I will never raise it again. Are we ruined? If we leave tonight, are we ruined?" And Eleanor, standing in the doorway, looking at the frightened old woman who had handed her so many sharp weapons and called it love, found that she could not, after all, hate her, and that pity was its own kind of count, endless, and that some sums do not balance, however long you work them. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "I think perhaps we are. But Jane is safe. That is settled and cannot be undone, whatever else is. And we have been ruined before, Aunt, you and I. And we are still here. And we will be ruined together and manage. Pack, I will see to the horses." The snow caught them 11 miles from Carfax Hall, at a coaching inn called the Hart and Garland, where the road went white, and the postboys refused the next stage with the flat finality of men who have buried friends in drifts, and Eleanor and her aunt were put into a low-beamed parlour with a smoking fire and a single tallow candle, and the news that they would go no further until the weather turned. Eleanor sat by the smoking fire with a chess knight in her fist. She had not meant to bring it. She had meant to leave it on the writing table in the green sitting room, beside the two folded lies. A clean renunciation, the goods returned. And then, at the last moment, in the dark, with the carriage waiting, she had gone back for it, and she could not have said why, except that her hand had wanted something true to hold, while the rest of her told the long lie of leaving. And the night was the truest false thing she owned. It only moved in arcs. It did all the work. It went where the straight pieces could not. She turned it over and over in her cold fingers and despised herself for the comfort of it. It was there, in the low parlour, that her aunt made her last frightened throw. "You will go back," said Mrs. Drummond. She had not unpacked. She stood by the door in her travelling cloak, as though the inn itself were a thing she might be made to leave, and her voice had the high, thin edge of a woman past the end of her courage. "When the snow turns, you will go back, and you will marry him, Eleanor, whatever he has done. And I do not ask, I have said I will not ask, because a ruined woman cannot afford a grievance, and a duke is a duke, though he were the very devil. And I am too old and too frightened to begin again in 2 rooms, with the damp coming through. You think me wicked to say it. I am not wicked. I'm only old and afraid, and I'm telling you the truth that love is too proud to tell. Take him. Take the title, and the coal, and the safety, and let the grievance be the price of it, as women have always let the grievance be the price of it. Think of yourself for once, instead of your pride." It was the cruelest thing her aunt had ever said to her, and Eleanor understood, looking at the shaking old woman in the doorway, that it was also the most loving, in the broken arithmetic of the frightened, that Mrs. Drummond was offering her the only wisdom she had, which was the wisdom of survival, and that it cost her something to offer it, because she could see, even through her fear, what it would cost Eleanor to take it. "No," Eleanor said. She said it gently. She stood, and she crossed to her aunt, and she took the cold, shaking old hands in her own, the hand with the knight still folded inside it, pressed warm between them. "No, aunt. Not this. I have been appraised and bought once already. I was 23 and I survived it. And I've spent 5 years building myself into a woman who would never stand still to be appraised again. And I will not undo that work for coal. I would rather the 2 rooms and the damp with my own soul about me than the whole of Renwick Cross with it sold. And you would too. You would, aunt. I have seen the miniature. I know there is a woman in you still who is loved for herself and remembers it. And I will not let your fear talk us both out of the one thing neither ruin nor a duke can take, which is that we know our own price, and it is not for sale. We will manage. We have hands. Jane is safe. Go up to bed. You are perished. We will not speak of going back." For a long moment, her aunt looked at her in the smoking light, and something moved across the old, frightened face. The woman in the miniature, perhaps, surfacing for the length of a breath through 40 years of fear. And then Mrs. Drummond pressed Eleanor's hands once, hard, and turned without another word, and went up the narrow inn stairs to her cold room, unbeaten and not victorious, only old, and left to think. Eleanor was alone perhaps a quarter of an hour. Then the inn door blew open on a gust of snow, and a man came in, stamping the white from his boots, hatless, his dark hair frozen at the ends, his face the grey of a man who has ridden 11 miles through a blizzard on a borrowed horse because the carriage was too slow. And the Duke of Renwick stood in the doorway of the Hart and Garland and looked at Eleanor Vane across the low parlour as though she were the single fixed thing in a world that rearranged itself without warning. "You did not even leave a feint behind you," he said. His voice was not steady. "Not so much as a swoon to remember you by. You simply counted the windows and walked out. I have ridden after you in weather that will likely cost me 2 fingers, and I had the whole of it planned, every word. And now I am here, and the words are gone, and I find I have only the true things left, which is all your doing. For you are the most ruinous woman in England, and you have taught me to say the true thing, or nothing." He took one step into the room and stopped, as though he did not trust himself nearer. "Adela's letter. You read it. I know you read it. It is gone from Pomfret's files, and your face is the face of a woman who has read it. I am not going to tell you it was a forgery, Eleanor. because it was not. I wrote it, every word. In the first days of November, before the guests were so much as arrived, I sat in my godmother's library and wrote to my man of business that a penniless girl with no people and an eager guardian would suit my purpose. But I required no affection, and she had none to spend, and that a sum settled on the sister would bind the elder's compliance. I wrote that. I meant it. It is the ugliest thing I have ever set my hand to, and I will not stand here and pretend the man who wrote it was not me. Because he was, and you would see through it in a heartbeat if I tried, and I am done. I am so entirely done, being seen through by you. Then we understand each other, Eleanor said. Her voice was the creditor's letter voice, flat and cold, the last armor she had. You have saved us both the trouble of a quarrel. You wrote the truth before I ever arrived, and you have been polishing the investment ever since, and I was fool enough to take the polish for. I had not met you when I wrote it, said the Duke. The words landed flat in the smoking room. I had not met you, he said again. I had not been thrown at, on a drawing-room floor, by the only woman in England who did not want me. I had not sat in a breakfast room and been told that affection is a performance that ends when the ledger does, by a person who understood it because she had lived it on my own staircase. I had not lain on a cold conservatory floor, counting panes wrong to make a child laugh. The man who wrote that letter had met none of you, Eleanor, and so he wrote about a connection, because a connection was all he could imagine. Because he was a man who had decided at 23 that he was a title with a man somewhere inside it, and would never be wanted for the man. He reached into his coat, not the breast, the deep right pocket, the pocket where the knight had lived, and drew out a folded document, heavy, sealed, a solicitor's hand on the outside, and he crossed the room at last and laid it in Eleanor's free hand, the hand that was not closed around his brother's knight, and closed her fingers over it, the way he had closed them over the knight in the conservatory. Read it. Not now. You will not be able to read my saying it and the page at once, I know you. You will count the words instead of hearing them. But later, when I am gone, and you are alone and afraid, and reaching for something true to hold. It is dated the 22nd of December, but is 4 days before Adela ever put her copy in your hand. You could not have known of it. I could not have known I should ever need to prove anything by it. It was done in secret, and for one reason only, and the reason was you. Eleanor's cold fingers held the heavy page. What is it? It is the breaking of my clock, said the Duke of Renwick. On the 22nd of December, I instructed Pomfret to satisfy my uncle's trust by the other door, to buy out the Cranes' interest in the guardianship outright, at a price that has cost me the Hampshire farms and the better part of what was loose in the funds, and to do it whether or not I married at all. As of the 22nd of December, Eleanor, I keep Lucy, if I am a bachelor at 90. The clock is gone. The deadline is gone. The last night of the year means nothing to me now, but the last night of the year. His voice cracked at last, clean across the middle, and he let it. Do you understand what I have done? I have spent half my fortune to make myself a man you cannot suspect. I have taken away my own weapon, exactly as I took away the one at your head in the stable yard, so that when I came to you, and I was always going to come to you, I had it planned for 12th night. I was going to do it under the lilacs in my mind 100 times before I lost the nerve. When I came to you, I should come with empty hands, and no clock and nothing to gain, and ask you for the one thing that was never in any ledger anywhere. I'm not asking you to marry a duke who needs a wife by Tuesday. There is no such duke any longer. I have ruined him on purpose. I'm asking you, Eleanor Vane, who fainted at my feet and counted the windows and would not be appraised, to marry a man who has made himself poor and free and certain, for no reason on this earth but that he loves you, and has since you opened your eyes in the wreckage of the worst plan in England, and were furious to find him there. The fire smoked. The snow ticked against the dark window. Somewhere above, a floorboard shifted under a frightened old woman who had gone up to think. Eleanor opened her hand and looked at the two true things she held: the ivory knight, warm from her grip, and the heavy sealed page, cold from his pocket. She broke the seal. She could not help it. She had to count the words. He was right. He was always right about her. And she unfolded the solicitor's document and read down the dense clerk's hand to the one line that mattered. The line dated the 22nd of December, and it ran exactly as he had said, that the Duke of Renwick did instruct that the claim of the Crane family upon the guardianship of Miss Lucy Renwick be extinguished and bought out entire, the same to take effect irrespective of His Grace's marriage or want of it, His Grace being resolved that the child's home shall hang upon no condition whatsoever. Irrespective of His Grace's marriage or want of it. The 22nd of December, 4 days before the wound. She looked up at him. The cold armor of her voice was gone. She had no feint left, and now no count left either. Nothing to hold but the truth, which was the most frightening thing she had ever been asked to hold. "You great fool," Eleanor said, and her voice broke too, on the word fool, and she did not try to mend it. "You have beggared yourself to prove a thing I should have known without a single page of it. I love you. There. I have said it first, you will note, which I shall hold over you for 50 years, that I was the brave one in the end. I love you, Julian. I have loved you since the conservatory, and feared it since the chessboard, and I let one wicked woman with a copied letter undo the whole of it in an afternoon, because I would rather believe the staircase than believe my own heart. And that is my cowardice, not yours. And I am done with it. I am done falling to escape rooms. I am going to stand still, in this dreadful inn, in front of this smoking fire, and let myself be loved. And it is the most terrifying thing I have ever done. And I am not going to faint." And the Duke of Renwick crossed the last of the floor between them, and did not let go of her. Caught her, as he had caught her the first night, one hand flat between her shoulder blades, and one closed warm over the fist that held his brother's knight, and held her upright against the cold, and the count, and the long habit of leaving. And this time, she put her weight on him, and did not pretend she could stand without it. And that was the whole of the difference. And it was everything. Her aunt came down in the cold grey of the next morning, while the snow was still bright and unbroken on the inn yard, and the Duke had gone out to see about thawing the road. And she came into the parlour, where Eleanor sat by a fire that no longer smoked, and she carried a single folded sheet in her 2 hands, as though it were heavier than it was. "I wrote this in the night," said Mrs. Drummond. She laid the sheet on the small table at Eleanor's elbow, within easy reach, and drew her hands back from it quickly, as one draws back from a thing one is afraid to want returned. "I heard you, last night, with him. I did not listen at the door. I am not so far gone as that. But the heart and garland has thin flaws, and I heard enough to know that you are to marry him after all, and freely, which is the one thing I had stopped believing a woman of our situation could do. And so I have done the only thing I have left to do, which is to take my own hands off you. Read it, or do not. I have said it badly, I am sure. I have not written a letter in earnest in 20 years. Eleanor unfolded the sheet. It was addressed to the Duke's man of business, and it was a poor, cramped, frightened hand, and she read down to the one line that mattered, the line that had plainly cost her aunt the whole of the night to write. That Mrs. Drummond did renounce any claim, comfort, or maintenance whatsoever upon my niece's marriage, and will answer for the late Mr. Drummond's debts out of my own jointure, though it leave me in 2 rooms, being resolved that Eleanor shall go to her husband, owing him nothing, and owing me less, for I have taken enough from her already." "You will do no such thing," Eleanor said, low. "I will do exactly such thing," said her aunt, "and you will let me, because it is the only dignity I have left. and I have just discovered I want it more than I want the coal. I have spent 5 years handing you knives and calling it love. I should like to spend whatever is left handing you nothing at all and calling it the same, and meaning it better." Her chin trembled and held. "I am sorry, Eleanor, for the staircase and the appraising and the long road here and the gown I made you wear to be looked at. I was loved once, and I forgot what it was for. Forgive me, or do not, I have no claim on that either, but I had to set it down before I could carry anything else." Eleanor rose and folded the cramped, brave letter, and did not put it in the place where she kept the things she could not look at. She put it in the place where she kept the things she meant to keep. "There is nothing to forgive that is not already forgiven," she said, and kissed her frightened aunt on the cheek, and added, "Because some sums only balance when you refuse the last subtraction. And you will not go to 2 rooms. You will come to Renwick Cross, where there is more house than 3 people can warm, and you will teach Lucy her stitches, and be insufferable about the linen, and we will be ruined together no longer, because it transpires we are not to be ruined at all. Now dry your eyes. His Grace is coming in, and he has begged himself for me, and I will not have him think I keep a household that weeps before noon." The lilacs at Renwick Cross came out in the 3rd week of May. They came out all at once, the way lilacs do, the long walk of them that the Duke's mother had planted breaking into purple and white between one warm morning and the next, so that Eleanor, the Duchess of Renwick now these 4 months, though she still turned to look behind her when the title was spoken, as if it must mean some other woman, came out onto the terrace after breakfast and stopped at the top of the steps with her breath taken clean away by the scent of them, the whole south front of the house gone heavy and sweet with bloom. Lucy was already down among them, on her stomach in the new grass, with the chessboard set up on a flat stone and the ivory knight in her hand. Eleanor had given it back to her on the wedding morning, folding the child's fingers over it the way it had twice been folded over her own, because a true thing is for holding when you are afraid, and Lucy would have more frights in her life than a duchess, and ought to have the best of the comforts. And she was making the knight do all the work against an imaginary opponent, and losing to it on purpose, and counting the lilac blooms aloud as she played, and getting the count gloriously, deliberately wrong. 41, Lucy announced, of a bush that had perhaps 100. 41, with the broken one. There is no broken one, dearest. They are flowers, said Mrs. Drummond, from the bench in the sun where she sat with her work basket, and her improved temper, and a piece of Lucy's hopeless embroidery. And she said it with such fond exasperation, such complete unfrightened ease, that Eleanor stood on the terrace and marvelled at her, the woman from the miniature, come all the way back at last in the warmth, as though fear had only ever been a kind of cold. The Duke came out and stood beside his wife at the top of the steps, and put a cup of coffee into her hands, because she was never warm enough in the early part of the day, whatever the season, and looked down at the child, and the old woman, and the purple walk, and the morning, and said nothing sensible at all, which was his way when a thing was too large for sense. "You are counting them," he said at last. "The blooms. I can see your lips." "I am not," said Eleanor, who had been. "I have given it up. I find I do not any longer need a true thing to hold while my body tells a lie, because my body has stopped telling them. There is nothing in me this morning that is not exactly what it looks like, which is a woman who is too happy, and a little afraid of it, on a terrace, in the smell of her husband's mother's lilacs, with no plan whatsoever, and no faint left in her anywhere." She leaned her shoulder into his arm, the arm like a ship's timber, and let her weight rest there in the sun. "It is the most terrifying thing I have ever done, standing still in the open and being glad. You will have to hold on to me." "I have not," said the Duke of Renwick, "the slightest intention of letting go." And below them, in the lilacs, the child set the bowed ivory knight down upon its stone, in a small, precise arc, where the May light caught it and held it, amber and warm and true. "Bitter orange," Eleanor said, and lifted her face and kissed him in the sun.